Good afternoon. Ooh, that's a hot mic. I like it. My name is Damon Siles. I'm the mayor of Carrboro, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all here today. I'm glad to be joined by also some of my elected colleagues from around the community, including Councilmember Paris Miller-Fouchy from the town of Chapel Hill, Orange County Commissioner Sally Green is here. I know we have a couple of judges in the house, District Court Judge Joel Brown and District Court Judge Hathaway Pendergrass. Did I miss any others? Oh, I'm sorry. And also Chapel Hill Town Council member Michael Parker is here. Thanks, Michael. Okay. I'm pleased to welcome you all here to share in, we're going to get to the Congresswoman, don't worry. I'm pleased to welcome you all here to share in what is now a Carrboro tradition, a community reading of Frederick Douglass's iconic speech, The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro, also known as What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Frederick Douglass delivered his speech 171 years ago on July 5th, 1852. And Carrboro's community reading of this speech is now in its 10th year. So that's great. The idea for doing this community event was brought forward 10 years ago now by former Orange Chatham Public Defender James Williams, who's here. And the first reading was organized by my predecessor and my friend, former Mayor Lydia Lavelle, who is also here. Last year, when I opened this event, I said that each year we learn that Douglass's words are not just a reflection on our past, but also a window on our present. I said this is particularly true in difficult years like this one, talking about last year, when we're reminded that the rights and liberties we're so often promised have never been enjoyed fully or equally by everyone. Well, here we are again. In just the last few weeks, we've seen what it means to have a North Carolina General Assembly that's unwilling to protect the well-being of all North Carolinians, or to protect even the right to vote or a fair election. We've seen what it means to have a United States Supreme Court that's unwilling to stand for equal protection of the laws. But we also know these things don't last. The ideology of separate but equal, the ideology of the patriarchy, the ideology of white supremacy are ideologies of the weak. And we know they can be overcome by organized progressive social movements, by artists and visionaries, and by forward-thinking judges, like some of those in this room, and lawmakers. I hope this Carrboro 4th of July tradition can give you some of the energy you need to stay in that fight, because you're gonna need it. So before we get to it, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. First, if you want to follow along with the reading today, you can find printed copies of the speech on the table out in the foyer. You can also find the text of the speech on the town's website at carrboro.nc.gov. And if you picked up one of those bookmarks in the foyer on the table, you'll notice there's a QR code on the back that will also link you to the text of the speech. Second, restrooms, the all-important restroom. There are restrooms in 2 locations, restrooms through the door behind me on your right, as well as restrooms downstairs off the main lobby. I would like to thank Town of Carrboro employees who made today's event possible, in particular, all right? In particular, Charles Harrington and his team from the Recreation and Parks Department, as well as our new Director of Recreation and Parks, JG, who's in the back row here. Thanks for being here today. And finally, I want to acknowledge the staff and volunteers of the Interfaith Council for Social Service who are out front, as you saw when you came in today. They're sharing information not only about the services that IFC provides to our community, but also about voter registration, which is going to be incredibly important this year. Okay, now I get to introduce the readers. I saw one more walking and just the one I needed to fill it. Just the one I needed. Okay. They are 34 volunteer community members. Many of them have read for us before, and you'll recognize them from previous readings. Some are first-timers. We have several first-timers this year. All of them are going to be great. I want to be sure to recognize all the readers, and so we can appreciate them here at the start. So if you'll please stand up or raise your hand when I call your name so we can appreciate you. This will be the same order in which you'll read from the speech today. And always first on that list is our very own Congresswoman Valerie Foushee. Following Congressman Foushee will be Quentin Harper. And then Nevaeh Hodge. Mauricio Solano. Maria Julia Eckhart. Jordan Coulter. And Jonas Coulter. And Julius Coulter. This is a family affair today because we also have Tiffany Palmer Lytle and Kendall Lytle here. Minister Robert Campbell. Miss Betty Curry. Ted Shaw. Naya Hamlet. Rodney Trice. Jonathan Brown. And Dolores Bailey. James Williams. Aaron Zoiker. Kate Fenhagen. Theodore Nollert. Michael Cousin. Chris Atack. And is Danita Mason-Hogans in the house? Okay, that's all right, we got backups, don't worry. Victor Glover. Rebecca Cerise. Deborah Stroman. Vicki Thornville. Lydia Lavelle. Donna Jones. Catherine Frey. Barbara Jessie Black. And of course, Michelle Laws. As I mentioned, we do have a couple of backup readers. These two friends have been reliable backups for several years running now, and I appreciate them being part of the event once again this year. And those are our two judges, Judge Brown and Judge Pendergrass. Thank you. Okay, so readers, that list that I just read, along with the numbers of your assigned passages, is also up here at the podium in case you need it. There's also a printed copy of the speech here if you don't have one with you. We'll be following the order in which I just read your names. And when the reader ahead of you is speaking, it would be a good idea for you to be ready and waiting over here on my left, your right, so that we can keep things moving. Audience members, please hold your applause until the end. I think you will find, and I can attest to this from having come to this event for many years now, that the speech has a much greater impact if you wait until the end and hear everyone read all the way through. And then at the end, we'll have James Williams offer some brief closing remarks. But first, I want to introduce our special guest. So every year, we begin this event by hearing from a guest speaker who shares a reflection on Douglas's speech. 10 years ago, on July 4th, 2014, at our first community reading of this event, our guest speaker was Professor Reginald Hildebrand. I'm pleased that Professor Hildebrand could return this year for our 10th anniversary. Reginald Hildebrand was a professor of African American Studies and History at Williams College and at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. After retiring from UNC Chapel Hill, he served for 3 years as an adjunct professor of history at Durham Tech. He's the author of The Times Were Strange and Stirring, Methodist Preachers and the Crisis of Emancipation. And he's currently working on a book with the working title, The Cleverest Document Issued This Century, Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Meanings of Freedom. In 2012, he received the Tanner Faculty Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching at UNC Chapel Hill. He's a former co-chair of the North Carolina Freedom Monument Project and a former trustee of the North Carolina Humanities Council. He served as a member of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and as a member of the advisory board for the North Carolina Historical Review. In 2018, he served as a member of the Historic Civil Rights Commemorations Task Force for the town of Chapel Hill. Professor Hildebrand has participated in this event for several years over the past decade, and I'm glad to have him back again this year. Please welcome Professor Reginald Hildebrand.
Thank you, Mayor, and you mentioned Congressperson Foushee, who, when she steps to this podium, she will be stepping into a legacy that she most beautifully represents as someone who is symbolic of all that Douglass tried to achieve. Thank you, and perhaps most importantly, she was my student. She had lots of professors, but I claim her. Thank you, Mayor Stiles, for that introduction and for carrying on in such a grand fashion this great Carrboro tradition that was instituted by your predecessor, Mayor Lavelle, who invested much time and care in making this thing go for 8 years, pandemic or no pandemic. She kept it moving forward. And of course, my friend James Williams, as most of you know, was the founding father of this community gathering. He went from being a renowned public defender to being an esteemed people's historian. And he has been a force behind this and many other programs and events that have enriched this community, including a recent program about the North Carolina Freedom Park in Raleigh, with the illuminated beacon of freedom at its center. Freedom Park will be completed and open for you to come see at the end of August. Please do. There are a few brochures out on your way in. Thank you, James, for all the work that you do to enhance and advance the historical consciousness of this community. This is the 10th time this community has come together in this remarkable way to affirm that when Frederick Douglass spoke for freedom and justice and denounced hypocrisy and oppression, he spoke for us. Douglass, who had been denied freedom completely, was able to articulate its meaning and value clearly and powerfully. Douglass, who had been a slave, understood the power and the universality of the words and ideals of the Declaration of Independence in ways that its author, a slave owner, could not comprehend. His denunciation of Thomas Jefferson's hypocrisy did not blind him to the truth and beauty of those ideals. So we have chosen to observe this day and the Declaration from the perspective of Douglass, not Jefferson. On this day, we proclaim that Mr. Douglass is a founding father of freedom, and it's an exemplar of the ongoing necessity to defend and struggle for freedom. On this day, we declare not only that he speaks for us, but also that he speaks to us. And during this program, Mr. Douglass will speak again through us. When we gathered together for the first time 10 years ago, it was in the boardroom of the town hall. Not a large space. It was packed with people spilling out into the hall. It was a great and moving occasion. Some of you were there. Now we meet in this large and beautiful building, and this event has become an important part of an important community tradition, part of the cultural identity of Carrboro that has been praised and copied by other communities. 10 years ago, Pat McCrory was the governor of North Carolina, and Barack Obama was the president of the United States. 10 years ago, President Obama signed the Ukraine Freedom Support Act following the Russian invasion and seizure of Crimea. During that year, the president pledged to use executive power to create a common sense middle ground approach to the urgent issue of immigration. During that year, Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner was killed by police in New York City. During the weekend of the 4th of July that year, 14 people were killed and 68 people were wounded during incidents of gun violence just in Chicago. And it was during that year that the State School Board of Texas mandated the use of new public school textbooks that presented a softer, kinder view of slavery and taught that slavery was not even one of the first two reasons for the outbreak of the Civil War. That was 10 years ago, and this is now. How much things have changed, and sadly, how much they have not. When Mr. Douglas gave his famous speech in 1852, the date he gave it, as the mayor has pointed out, was actually July 5th, because the 4th fell on a Sunday that year. He spoke in the beautiful and ornate Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York, which was located very near the offices of the anti-slavery newspaper that Douglas owned and edited. The program was organized by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. So it was a friendly audience. In reality, it was an audience much like this one. Good people of different backgrounds who had come together to hear Mr. Douglas because his words, his example, his courage, his integrity inspired and encouraged them and helped them to keep the faith. Historian William McFeely wrote that Douglas's 4th of July speech was, and I quote, perhaps the greatest anti-slavery oration ever given. Professor McFeely had it right. It was not just a speech, it was an oration. A few years earlier, when young Douglas was just beginning to earn his reputation as an anti-slavery lecturer, a journalist made this observation about him. The fugitive Douglas was up when we entered. This is an extraordinary man, a commanding person, over 6 feet. As a speaker, he has few equals. It is not declamation, but oratory, power of debate. He has wit, argument, sarcasm, pathos, all that first-rate men show in their master efforts. His voice is highly melodious and rich, and his enunciation, quite elegant. And yet, he has been but 2 or 3 years out of the house of bondage. Just 2 years before his famous oration, the Congress of the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In effect, it put a price on the head and a bounty on the person of any nominally free Black man or woman anywhere in the country. According to the text of that law, it empowered the people who claimed to own other people to pursue and reclaim such fugitive person either by procuring a warrant from someone of the courts or by seizing and arresting such fugitive where the same can be done without process. In no trial or hearing under this act shall testimony of such alleged fugitive be admitted in evidence. The punishment was severe for anyone who tried to interfere with the enforcement of that law. As you will hear later, Mr. Douglas had the Fugitive Slave Act on his mind when he spoke about American independence. Toward the end of that speech, he said, "Not fewer than 40 Americans have within the past 2 years been hunted down without a moment's warning, hurried away in chains, and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have wives and children dependent on them for bread. But of this no account is made. For Black men there is neither law nor justice, humanity nor religion. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime." But it was not just Congress, the legislature, that posed a problem. 7 years after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down the Dred Scott decision. In fact, the Chief Justice of the court referred to the Declaration of Independence in his decision, in which he explained, "The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed to the citizen?" In the opinion of the court, the legislation and the histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. Then the Chief Justice continued to drive home his point. He went on, "They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. This opinion was at the time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race." The Chief Justice made clear that in his view, and in the view of the majority of the court, the white people who had thought that Black people were persons and who had the potential to become citizens were not just wrong, they were uncivilized. That was the racial climate in which Douglas lived and moved and fought for freedom. If there ever was a time to throw up your hands and say, "I quit, I've had enough," what's the point in continuing this struggle? The obstacles we face are historic, systemic, and permanent. They're so high we can't get over them, so low we can't go under them. so wide we can't go around them. Why should I expect or even hope that things will ever get any better? That's what a sane person might have said. But 10 years later, Mr. Douglas delivered his oration in 1852, but 10 years later, he wrote these words: "Common sense, the necessities of the war, to say nothing of the dictation of justice and humanity, have at last prevailed. We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous decree. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, in his own peculiar, cautious, forbearing, and hesitating way, slow, but we hope sure, has said, while the loyal heart was near breaking with despair, he proclaimed and declared that on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free." Mr. Douglas continued to celebrate the issuance of Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation with these words: "Free forever. Oh, long enslaved millions whose cries have so vexed the air and sky, suffer on a few more days. The hour of your deliverance draws nigh. O ye millions of free and loyal men who have earnestly sought to free your bleeding country from the dreadful ravages of revolution and anarchy, lift up now your voices with joy and thanksgiving, for with freedom to the slave will come peace and safety to your country." 10 years later. But how do we get from what he said in 1852 to what he wrote in 1862? Well, in between, in fact, exactly 5 years in between, in 1857, Douglas gave his second most famous speech, in which he said, "Let me give you a word. Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress." It was that belief, that commitment, that faith that kept Mr. Douglas in struggle, even when the chances for success were bleak, even when despair must have haunted him. The point is not that in time progress is inevitable, or even that struggle always leads to progress. It may not. And even when it is achieved, progress can be reversed. But we have to struggle on anyway, because that is the only chance we have of moving forward. Mr. Douglas put it this way: He said, men may not get all they pay for in this world, but they must certainly pay and struggle for all they get. Which brings us back to today. These are unsettling times, not as unsettling as when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed or when the Dred Scott decision was handed down, but the issues that confront us now remind us that freedom is neither permanent nor self-enforcing. It is easily distorted, diminished, and limited. And so it must be our ongoing work to affirm it, defend it, and expand it. What got Mr. Douglass through was the belief, his firm faith, his unshakable commitment to freedom, his inclusive and enlightened humanity, and his consistent commitment to a broad-based sense of social justice. Our times have some special challenges. In this corporate, commercial, social media-driven culture, leaders and movements, and even values and ideals, even great speeches, are transformed into commodities and entertainment, clicks and tweets, likes and dislikes. The electronic devices we hold in our hands have a hold on our minds. Their algorithms lead us wherever they want. They allow us to believe that we are pushing their buttons, when in fact, it is just the other way around. There is much to discourage, distract, enrage, and confuse us. There is much that can misdirect our attention and our energy and trivialize our lives. Much that seems to be real isn't. Noise and money can keep us from hearing voices that we need to hear. Too often, rage replaces reason. There is much at stake. So like Douglass, we need to be grounded in something real. Like Mr. Douglass, we need a belief, a commitment, a faith that we can keep, that is strong enough and real enough to keep us during times of confusion and discouragement. So on the occasion of this 10th time we have gathered together, we might consider what we are doing now that might have some impact 10 years from now. What goal are we setting? What stand are we taking? What justice are we seeking? What truth are we telling? What child are we teaching? What history are we learning? What campaign are we supporting? What organization are we forming or joining? What great program like this one are we starting or helping to continue? What love and compassion are we showing? What faith are we keeping that might have some positive impact 10 years from now on the people and the issues that we care about and that are the reasons we are all here today?
It is our 10th annual reading, but the first reading that will begin with a member of Congress. And we don't just invite any member of Congress to read with us. We invite the member of Congress who was raised in this community and who comes back whenever she can and insists on being in her community whenever she can be, even after long days in Washington. When I invited our first reader to be a part of this year's reading, but was a little worried, I said to her, maybe Congress has got you too busy to be here for this. She said no. She wouldn't miss it, of course. So we'll start with Congresswoman Valerie Foushee.
The task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I do not remember ever have to appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. The papers and the placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. Fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is, to me, a matter of astonishment as well as gratitude. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. You are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon.
Fellow citizens, 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people in which you now glory was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government, England as the fatherland, although a considerable distance from your home, impose in the exercise of its parental prerogatives upon its colonial children such restraints, such burdens, such limitations as in its mature judgment it deemed wise, right, and proper. But your fathers, who had not adopted the idea of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presume to defer from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need to say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers, feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, Your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned, they remonstrated, they did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn. Yet they persevered.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, woefully incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there's always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than we, at this distance of time, regard it. The timid and the prudent of that day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Their opposition to the then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful, but amid all their terror and affrighted vociferations against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on in the country with it. On the 2nd of July, 1776, the Old Continental Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshippers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. We seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day, whose transparency is at all equally resolved, that these united colonies are in the right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown.
Citizens, your fathers made good that resolution. They succeed, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ring ball in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny.
Ciudadanos, sus padres cumplieron bien esa resolución. Ellos triunfaron y hoy cosechas los frutos del éxito de tus padres. La libertad que ganaron es tuya y tú, por lo tanto, puedes celebrar este aniversario. El 4 de julio es el primer gran acontecimiento en la historia de su nación, el cerrojo en la cadena de tu destino aún no desarrollado.
Pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold in the perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring ball of the chain of your nation's destiny. So, indeed, I regret it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost.
El orgullo y patriotismo, no menos que la gratitud, te inspiran a celebrar y recordarlo perpetuamente. He dicho que la Declaración de la Independencia es el cerrojo en la cadena del destino de tu nación. Entonces, de hecho, lo considero. Los principios contenidos en este instrumento son principios de salvación. Manténganse fieles a esos principios. Sean leales a ellos en todas las situaciones, en todos los lugares, contra todos los enemigos y a cualquier precio.
Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did, and for the purpose they contended for. I will unite with you to honor their memory.
They loved their country better than their own private interests, and all will concede that as a rare virtue that ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man who is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests.
They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memories of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times.
How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. Mark them, fully appreciating the hardship to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them. Your fathers, the fathers of this republic, laid the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in the grandeur around you.
Of this fundamental work, this day is the anniversary. Our eyes are met with demonstrations of joyous enthusiasm. The causes which led to the separation of the colonies from the British Crown have never lacked for a tongue. They have all been taught in your common schools, narrated at your firesides, unfolded at your pulpits, and thundered from your legislative halls, and are as familiar to you as household word. They form the staple of your national poetry and eloquence. I leave, therefore, the great deeds of your fathers to others. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future. Now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labors of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence.
Fellow citizen, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principle of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefit and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us. Would to God, both for your sake and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truly returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of disparity between us, and I am not included within the pales of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessing in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your father is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you have brought strife and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in feathers into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in a joyful anthem, where in human mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean citizen? Citizen to mock me by asking me to speak today?
Fellow citizens, above your national turbulent joy, I hear the mournful wails of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today, rendering more intolerable by the Jubilee shouts that reach them. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be a treason, most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world.
My subject, then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day from the slave's point of view, standing here identified with the American bondsman, making his wrongs mine. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and the conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declaration of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of honesty, of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all of the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or who is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right and just.
I hear some of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a Black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being?
Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read and to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls in the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then will I argue with you that the slave is a man. Is it not astonishing that while we are plowing and planting and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading and writing and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprise common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living as in families as husbands, wives, children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave. We are called upon to prove that we are men.
Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? It is to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation, as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principles of justice. Hard to understand? Hard to be understand? How should I look today in the presence of Americans to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him.
What? Am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply.
What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it, that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There's blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? I cannot. The time for such argument is past. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. Search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival.
Take the American slave trade, which we are told by the papers is especially prosperous just now, as the price of men was never higher. and which is carried out in all the large towns and cities in one half of this confederacy. This trade is one of the peculiarities of American institutions. In several states, this trade is a chief source of wealth. It's called the internal slave trade, in order to divert from it the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated. The foreign slave trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy, as an execrable traffic. To arrest it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as a most inhuman traffic, opposed alike to the laws of God and of man. It is, however, a notable fact that while so much execration is poured out by Americans upon those engaged in the foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation and their business is deemed honorable.
Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market. You know what is a swine drover? I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all our southern states. They perambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh jobbers armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave market at New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mill.
Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along an inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See too that girl of 13 weeping. Yes, weeping as she thinks of the mother from whom she's been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly you hear a quick snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank and the chain rattles simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on.
Follow this drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See this drove sold and separated forever, and never forget the deep, sad sobs that arose from that scattered multitude. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun you can witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking. Yet this is but a glance as the American slave trade as it exists at this moment in the ruling part of the United States.
I was born amid such sights and scenes. To me, the American slave trade is a terrible reality. The fleshmongers gather up their victims by dozens and drive them chained to the General Depot at Baltimore. When a sufficient number have been collected here, a ship is chartered for the purpose of conveying the forlorn crew to Mobile or to New Orleans. From the slave prison to the ship, they are usually driven in the darkness of night. In the deep, still darkness of midnight, I have been often aroused by the dead, heavy footsteps in the piteous cries of the chain gangs that passed our door.
Fellow citizens, this murderous traffic is today in active operation in the boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on the highways of the South. I see the bleeding footsteps.
I hear the doleful wail of fettered humanity on the way to the slave markets, where the victims are to be sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There, I see the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men. My soul sickens at the sight.
But a still more inhuman, disgraceful, and scandalous state of things remains to be presented. By an act of the American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. Mason and Dixon's land has been obliterated. New York has become West Virginia. And the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States.
The power is coextensive with the Star-Spangled Banner and American Christianity. Where these go, may also go the merciless slave hunter. Where these are, man is not sacred. He is a bird for the sportsman's gun. By that most foul and fiendish of all human decrees, the liberty and person of every man are put in peril. Your broad Republican domain is hunting ground for men.
Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your secretary of state enforce as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country and to your God that you do this accursed thing. Not fewer than 40 Americans have within the past 2 years been hunted down and without a moment's warning hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have had wives and children dependent on them for bread. But of this no account was made. The right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage and to all the rights in this republic, the rights of God included. For Black men, there is neither law nor justice, nor humanity nor religion. The fugitive slave laws make mercy to them a crime and bribe the judges who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery and $5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any two villains is sufficient under this hell-black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary Black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witness for himself. The minister of American justice is bound by the law to hear but one side, and that side is the side of the oppressor.
Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Let it be thundered around the world that in tyrant killing, king hating, people loving, democratic, Christian America, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound in deciding in the case of man's liberty to hear only his accusers. in glaring violation of justice, in shameful disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolic intent, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation.
Americas, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 million of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crown-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to be the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad. Honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives from your own land you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill. You glory in your refinement and your universal education, yet you maintain a system as barbarous and dreadful as ever stained the character of a nation, a system begun in arrogance, supported in pride, and perpetuated in cruelty.
You shed tears over fallen Hungary and make the sad story of her wrongs the themes of your poets, statesmen, and orators, till your gallant sons are ready to fly arms to vindicate her cause against the oppressor. But in regard to the 10,000 wrongs of the American slave, you would enforce the strictest silence and would hail him as an enemy of the nation who dares to make those wrongs the subject of public discourse. You're all on fire at the mention of liberty for France or for Ireland, but are as cold as an iceberg at the thought of liberty for the enslaved of America. You discourse eloquently on the dignity of labor, yet you sustain a system which, in its very essence, casts a stigma upon labor. You can bare your bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tea-on tax, and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that, quote, of one blood God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of all the earth, and hath commanded all men everywhere to love one another, end quote. Yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own.
You declare before the world and are understood by the world to declare that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than ages of that which your fathers rose in rebellion to repose. A seventh part of inhabitants of your country. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth.
It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it, and yet you cling to it as if it were the sheet anchor of all your hopes. Be warned.
A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever.
But it is answered in reply to all this that precisely what I have now denounced is, in fact, guaranteed and sanctioned by the Constitution of the United States, that the right to hold and to hunt slaves is a part of that Constitution framed by the illustrious fathers of this republic. Then I dare to affirm, notwithstanding all I have said before, your fathers, instead of being the honest men I have before declared them to be, were the veriest impostors that ever practiced on mankind. This is the inevitable conclusion, and from it there is no escape. But I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution of the United States. It is a slander upon their memory, at least, so I believe, and others have, as I think fully and clearly vindicated the Constitution from any design to support slavery for an hour.
Allow me to say, in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. I, therefore, leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference. The time was when such could be done, but a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. Wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. From Boston to London is now but a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed of one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. In the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying it, all God speed the day when human blood shall cease to flow, and every clime be understood, the claims of human brotherhood, and each return for evil good, not blow for blow. That day will come, all feuds to end, and change into a faithful friend, each foe.
That was, as usual, fantastic. Let's hear it one more time for all 35 of our readers tonight. I'd like to invite James Williams to come up, as he often does each year, for brief closing remarks and to let us know what other kinds of events of interest might be coming up in the near future, later this summer and fall. And also just want to appreciate James for 10 years of this event that was his idea.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Wow. I just feel we need to give another round of applause to our readers today. Yes. And Dr. Hildebrand, I mean, no, he was the first opening speaker, and I think it was the best decision that we could have made in launching this event, was to have Professor Hildebrand to be the opening speaker. And so it was so appropriate on this the 10th year of this event, to have him come and deliver again. And now, you know, he's a learned man. He's a scholar. You know, he's a teacher. I think he's kind of, a preacher too. He's got that in him, but he certainly is an orator. And I just love how he can deliver knowledge in such an engaging way. Not everybody can do that. We know that. So thank you so much, Dr. Hildebrand. And thank the town of Carrboro and the mayor and staff for hosting this event over this decade. So I want to say that too. And I know I'm supposed to make brief remarks, and that's sometimes people say I tend to talk a little too much. I am going to be brief. It's not try to be. I'm going to be brief this afternoon. There are a couple of things I do want to point out, though, that I think is very striking about this speech that Frederick Douglass gave during such a trying and difficult time. And that is that he starts out with hope. That the last sentence of the second paragraph, he's talking about hope. He's approaching this with hope. And then he ends with hope. And I think that's worth mentioning, given, and Professor Hildebrand talked about some of the challenges that we have, the waves of challenges that we have confronting us today. And I think one thing that we can take from this Douglass speech is the importance of maintaining hope as we go about doing the necessary work. And that's another piece that I want to talk about, because he mentioned, Dr. Hildebrand mentioned that there was a Dred Scott decision about 5 years after Frederick Douglass gave the speech in 1857. There's a Dred Scott decision. It's kind of hard to imagine things getting worse from 1852 to 1857, but they did. But Frederick Douglass is still there. He's still fighting the good fight. And he gives this remarkable speech that Dr. Hildebrand gave, talked about, West Indian Emancipation Day speech in 1857. But here again, instead of throwing in the towel and saying, it's too difficult, he gave us a prescription of how we should move forward in these very difficult times. And, he talked about one thing, how power concedes nothing without a struggle. So we know that we are in for a fight, but we have to fight if we're going to make progress. But he also talks, about, how you go about doing that. And I won't repeat what Dr. Hilbrand talked some about that. I would encourage you to take a look at that speech also as we navigate, the next year or two. But even beyond that, Frederick Douglass died in 1895. So that's over 40 years after he gave this 1852 speech. And I read, and I'm told that a couple of weeks before he died, and he was in poor health at that time, someone asked him what advice would he give to young Black people. Well, they said today, but they were talking about, at that moment. And he said, agitate, agitate, agitate. And I think that's what we have to do given the situation that we're in today. There was a rap artist, I want to say maybe Killer Mike, it could have been somebody else. But he said these words: plot, plan, strategize, mobilize, organize. And I think that is what we're called upon today to deal with the onslaught that we are confronting to freedom, equality, and justice today. So I'll leave it there, and thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you next year.
All right, friends and neighbors, you have your marching orders. Go out and get it done, and stay cool doing it today.